neste momento único da história dos nossos povos, em que Angola vai nascer para a comunidade das nações e Portugal se retira definitivamente do continente africano.
Portugal's last High Commissioner in Angola, Admiral Cardoso, announces his country's withdrawal from the African colony.
Dirijo-me também, por vosso intermédio, ao resto do mundo.
The announcement was made to the world's press because the war raging between three rival African nationalist movements meant that on Independence Day, November the 11th, there was no new government acceptable to everyone to whom the Portuguese could hand over power.
Não ser possível tomar parte em qualquer cerimónia comemorativa da hora maior do seu próprio futuro.
Situated in southwestern Africa, Angola was the last of Portugal's African colonies to achieve independence after 500 years of colonial rule. When the Portuguese left, they took with them many of the symbols that characterized their centuries of rule, like this statue of Portugal's greatest poet, Camões. But the country they left behind them has begun its independence in a state of civil war. The Portuguese began reducing their military presence in Angola early this year. By the last day of their rule, very few were left for the formal withdrawal ceremony. In previous independence ceremonies, the colonial power has always had the new government on hand to raise the new flag as the old one came down. This time it was different. Ships from the Portuguese Navy were waiting in the harbour of the capital, Luanda, to take the remaining soldiers and officials back to Portugal. As the last Portuguese ship left Luanda harbour, the guerrillas of one of the three rival nationalist movements, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, were on the shore to see it go. The MPLA, in control of the capital, moved to claim the country. A few hours after the Portuguese had left Luanda, the MPLA declared it was forming a government. The flag was raised, and the movement's president, Agostinho Neto, announced the formation of the Popular Republic of Angola.
Em nome do povo angolano, o Comitê Central do Movimento Popular de Libertação de Angola, MPLA, proclama o nosso país constituído em República Popular de Angola.
The ceremonies continued the next morning, with a rally addressed by NATO and representatives of some of the few foreign governments who had backed his seizure of power. The man who drew most applause was an old comrade in arms of NATO's, Marcelino dos Santos, vice president of the FNLA movement that had fought against Portugal in Mozambique, and which now forms that country's government. He promised support for NATO's new regime. from UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. At the ceremony, supported by their allies, the FNLA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, they hauled up their flag and announced the formation of a rival government. They renamed the country the Democratic People's Republic of Angola. The man who heads behind FNLA-UNITA is the UNITA chief, Jonas Savimbi. He told the crowd at this Independence Day rally that the period ahead held suffering and bloodshed before Angola could be at peace. And for him, the diplomatic situation was even worse than for NATO, since not a single foreign government extended him formal recognition. The crowds in Nova Lisboa, like those in Luanda, treated independence as a festive occasion, but major problems lie ahead for both sides. Quite apart from internal strife, Angola's attracted the attention of many foreign powers. It's an area of vital strategic significance in southern Africa. It lies to the north of Namibia, or southwest Africa, which is administered by South Africa, and its independence has moved the frontiers of black Africa even closer to the citadel of apartheid. Most of Zambia's copper is transported by rail through Angola to the sea. Zaire is interested in the future of the offshore oil in the Angolan enclave of Cabinda in the north. Angola has other economic resources too, diamonds and iron, and it's one of the world's largest coffee producers. Its position and wealth make it potentially one of Africa's most important states. The guerrilla war in Angola started in early 1961, with both MPLA and FNLA launching attacks on the Portuguese. This film, taken in Cabinda in 1968, shows guerrillas in one of the training camps that dotted the remoter regions of the country. By the time of the Portuguese coup in April last year, guerrilla units were active over large areas of Angola, although they were far from defeating the Portuguese, who'd committed thousands of troops to holding on to the country and its riches. After the coup, Portuguese determination to continue the war disappeared, and the jockeying for power amongst the guerrillas began. Savimbi's movement, UNITA, is the newest of the three. It was formed in 1966, after Savimbi's split from the FNLA. It operated deep inside the country, and so was almost unknown to the outside world before the Portuguese coup. Since then, though, its brand of moderate socialism has rallied support not only amongst the Africans, but also amongst many white settlers who wish to remain in Angola. The rapid rise in UNITA's strength over the past few months has taken many observers by surprise, but it now looks as though it commands the greatest popular support.
After this conference, something will come out.
The FNLA's leader is Holden Roberto, who for many years has been in exile in Zaire. His movement launched its struggle against the Portuguese early in 1961, but for most of the late 60s and early 70s remained virtually confined to the thick forest near the Zaire border, even though its army, mainly stationed in Zaire, was perhaps the largest of all the guerrilla forces. After the Portuguese coup, the FNLA stepped up operations and took control of large areas in the north. These FNLA troops, seen near Caxito a few months ago, were the vanguard of an FNLA strike force that tried to drive the MPLA out of Luanda. That offensive failed, but since then they've been stationed in strength not far from the capital. Agostinho Neto, the MPLA's leader, was once best known as a poet, but is now clearly the most left-wing of the three guerrilla chiefs. He has close ties with the Soviet Union and its allies, from whom he gets most of his aid. Unlike Savimbi and Roberto, he lacks a strong tribal base, and his support is mainly in the towns. The MPLA fired the first shot in the guerrilla war against the Portuguese in February 1961 and was perhaps the most active group up until the coup. Since then, it's received backing from left-wing elements in Portugal, and NATO hoped that Portugal would eventually hand over power to him, keeping the other two movements out in the cold. That hope failed to materialize, and now the MPLA must fight for its power.
O Estado português e os movimentos de libertação nacional de Angola, Frente Nacional de Libertação de Angola, FNLA.
The agreement between Portugal and the three movements over Angola's future was concluded in Lisbon in January this year. President Francisco da Costa Gomes persuaded the three movements to work together in the pre-independence period. Before independence in November, they were supposed to form a joint government and integrate their forces prior to the holding of free elections. Strong pressure from the Portuguese forced the three groups into the agreement, but within a few weeks it became clear that the terms were unworkable.
Até ao termo do período transitório, o Colégio Presidencial poderá, sempre que o deseje, consultar o Alto Comissário sobre assuntos relacionados com a
The provisional government was set up in Luanda with Portuguese participation, but the heady words of the January agreement were soon shown to mean very little. Clashes broke out between MPLA and FNLA units throughout the country, as well as in Luanda itself, and the capital was soon flooded with refugees fleeing from the rural areas. Portuguese attempts to maintain peace were ineffective, and both groups engaged in a massive propaganda campaign to win the population to their side. With the colonial power failing to reconcile the groups, independent African states, concerned about the country advancing to independence in the middle of a civil war, began to take a hand. One summit meeting was called in the Kenyan town of Nakuru at the invitation of President Kenyatta. All three groups, under pressure from the African heads of state, attended the talks, which tried to resolve the differences between the movements and find ways of implementing the January agreement. At first, it seemed as though Kenyatta's mediation had been successful.
We have come to the last ceremony of the meeting, and that is the signing of the agreement, which our three brothers are going to sign. And I call upon them to do the ceremony of signing the document.
Despite the apparent accord, the Nakuru agreement, like its predecessor, failed to work. Not long afterwards, the MPLA drove the FNLA out of Luanda, and UNITA was also drawn into the fighting for the first time, even though it tried hard to remain aloof. With the date for independence approaching and civil war raging, Angola's white settlers decided to quit in their thousands. Before the Portuguese coup, about 500,000 whites lived in Angola. The renewed fighting caused a sudden panic, and some 300,000 or 400,000 fled the country. The whites' departure crippled the Angolan economy, and for those who had been encouraged to settle by Portuguese government promises of wealth and opportunity, it was a sad end to their dreams. Today, many of them are among the strongest supporters of the right wing in a Portugal which is itself torn by strife. With independence approaching and the future of the country's government still unclear, a massive wave of fighting broke out in late September. As a result, Angola's political map radically changed, with large areas falling under the control of MPLA's opponents. The battle lines today look like this: UNITA holding the south, MPLA the middle and the oil-rich enclave of Cabinda, and FNLA parts of the north. But the picture's changed dramatically in the last month. Since they launched their offensive, UNITA forces, with an allied column of FNLA troops, have taken over virtually all the seaboard in the south of the country, capturing several major ports, including Lobito, the terminal of the crucial railway from Zaire and Zambia. UNITA's now threatening Teixeira de Sousa in the east, and in conjunction with an FNLA push from the north, is threatening to cut the MPLA areas in two. If the MPLA isn't able to stabilize its defense lines, it could soon be hemmed in around Luanda, and the war might swiftly come to an end. The port city of Lobito, captured by UNITA a few days ago after being in MPLA hands for 2 months, provided Jonas Savimbi with a riotous welcome. Lobito is perhaps the most important city captured by UNITA in the current offensive. But questions are now being asked about how exactly they've managed to move ahead so quickly, even though they have their own motorized transport. The key to UNITA's success may be their use of these Panhard armoured cars, which are a match for any armour the MPLA's had, at least until recently. The question everyone's asking is, who's been handling the Panhards, and who supplied them? The MPLA claims that South Africa is involved. While driving a few miles outside Lobito during Savimbi's visit there, our crew came across Panhards by the roadside. The drivers were white and didn't want to be filmed. These shots were taken secretly. On being questioned, these men claimed they were from London, though they spoke with a distinct South African accent. We asked Dr. Savimbi where his white supporters came from and whether the government of South Africa had provided him with any military aid or regular troops to assist his drive against the MPLA.
They are not South African troops committed by South African government here.
Who were the men I spoke to with South African accents?
I was not there, so we have many white people here. If not many, but some who are working for us. It does not mean that they are South Africans, or they are sent by South African government or by another government.
Well, if the people I spoke to were South African, and I'm convinced they were because of their accents and their uniforms, who are they committed by? What other government is acting as an agent for them?
First of all, I'm saying that the uniform is not, because the uniforms they are wearing, all the people who are working with us, are our uniforms. You cannot find a different uniform. This one I'm wearing, it is a French, but we bought it with our money. The other one is a Portuguese. We don't have a second one. Then, first of all, this is not true.
Could they be South African mercenaries?
We don't have a South African mercenary.
We also asked South Africa's Foreign Minister, Dr. Muller, about reports of South African involvement.
Well, we've had our setbacks.
Well, that has been denied. I must, however, point out that there are small numbers of South African troops at the Colonial project, which is under construction and which has been going on for some years, by virtue of an international agreement entered into between South Africa and Portugal. Those troops have been there for weeks, and it's no secret. There's nothing sinister about it. As a matter of fact, it was at the time discussed with the Portuguese, who promised to provide their own troops in order to protect the workers and the equipment and to see to it that the water supply from the Kunini River to Owambaland wasn't cut off. So they're still there.
But is, being more specific, is South Africa supplying arms or weapons or money to support UNITA?
No. I can only confirm what's been said by members of my government in the past. South Africa is not involved in that war. The South African forces are not operating in this war.
Despite denials from Dr. Muller and Dr. Savimbi, the question of South African involvement still seems unclear, and many reporters on the spot are convinced that South African troops are present. There's no doubt, though, that all three forces have Portuguese fighting with them, some of them members of the movements, and some perhaps as mercenaries. The MPLA definitely have foreign troops fighting with them. In the battles around Lobito, UNITA captured a Cuban soldier, allegedly one of several thousand aiding Dr. NATO's forces. His name, he told us, was Samuel Rodriguez, a private in the Cuban army from Matanzas province.
¿Dónde? ¿Qué provincia? Sí. Matanzas.
There are strong rumors, too, of a growing Russian involvement with the MPLA. Planes, tanks, and other heavy armor are reportedly being shipped in, raising the specter of a possible intervention by at least one of the great powers. The FNLA has for years had its main base in Zaire, and there are now reports that Zaire's President Mobutu has committed several thousand of his own troops to bolster Holden Roberto's forces. Roberto also gets support from the unlikely combination of the United States and China, though there's no evidence that either of these big powers are actively involved on the ground. Both sides in the war can now use the ports as well as airfields for arms supplies, and there's now a steady flow of heavy weapons to both sides. In the past, all three movements fought each other, as well as the Portuguese, but only with light weapons. Today, the full firepower of modern equipment is being brought into play, and UNITA believes that the MPLA will soon start using Russian-supplied MiG jet fighters, which could seriously affect the outcome of the war. The fighting has caused thousands of casualties, not only amongst the opposing armies, but also amongst Angolan civilians. And the hospitals, lacking both personnel and medicines, now that the Portuguese have pulled out, can no longer cope with the injured. One kind of foreign aid that both sides are receiving, and which both of them welcome, is from the International Red Cross, which, together with other charities, is doing its best to supply at least the most essential medicines and foodstuffs to the areas most affected by the fighting. With the economy collapsing, there are now perhaps 250,000 people facing starvation. A major relief effort would be difficult to arrange, but one is clearly needed. The war still seems far from over, but it now looks as though it could be Jonas Savimbi who comes out on top. There's certainly no doubt of Savimbi's popularity. Whites who stayed behind in the areas he controls show their support for him too. A few days ago, we asked Dr. Savimbi how he saw the future of Angola if it proved impossible to work out a negotiated peace.
I think we still work for peace. Even when there is no peace, we still feel and believe in peace. Because when we are making war, we are making it for the objective of peace.
You will be negotiating presumably with
the MPLA and their allies over the next few weeks and months, what chance of success will there be, do you think?
I think very great because we don't feel bitter. We deplore the civil war, but we don't feel bitter. Then we will be open to discuss with them at any time. It is a pity that now the war has to go on for some time, mostly because of the attitude of the Soviet Union, which gives us the impression that they will back up MPLA to the last. But we think that the Angolans, members of MPLA themselves, will realize that it is very difficult to any one of us to win the war.
And what future is there for the white Angolan, the Portuguese in this country?
We have given them guarantees and we have repeated them that they are Angolans, so they can stay. And you see the few who have decided to stay, they are mixing up with our people without any discrimination, without any resentment, without any ill feeling. So we hope that those who have gone to Portugal, when things will be settled, they will come. Even if they want to come now, in the areas that we control, they will be very much welcome.
Are you very pessimistic about the future?
I have never been pessimistic. I have been always optimistic, but I am a realist too.
The past few days have shown that while Dr. Savimbi and his allies talk of peace, they are still waging war, and the same is true of the MPLA. With the war apparently reaching a crucial stage, an agreement between the three movements to share power seems further away than ever before. UNITA's anthem is the moving hymn, God Save Africa, and it's a sentiment with which most Angolans, whatever their politics, might well agree.